My name is Alex Dworjan. I'm an Ansible solution specialist, and today I'm going to be focusing on how Ansible can be used for networking automation and use some examples around Cisco IOS. So why do I care about network automation? As today's IT landscapes have grown, so have networks. No longer am I just responsible for a single data center. I may be responsible for maintaining networking devices across multiple data centers, across different cloud environments, different cloud regions, as well as outside the data center infrastructure, such as routers and switches on factory floors or inside stores. So it really becomes much more difficult to know exactly what my current state is and make changes necessary to keep operations in check. So it can be helpful to just easily pull facts from all the different vendors. Regardless of how many different vendors I have, I can easily see exactly what my current state is and make simple changes. I can also integrate with some of my existing tool set. So if I need to have change requests created in ServiceNow, or I want to have a self-service capability to add firewall rules that go through that business review process, I can integrate in with something like ServiceNow or integrate with network monitoring tools to automatically respond to some basic events. This also gives you the ability to have a common language and tool across all of your virtual, physical, and cloud networking devices. This also means I can have the same language for those virtual machines as well. So I don't have to learn a different command to change an iOS configuration versus an EOS Arista configuration. I can also use that same language to make change to a VLAN in Microsoft Azure. So this allows me to really expand out and improve my overall understanding of my environment without having to learn multiple different commands across different vendors. With the changes in security posture that go along with some of the modern IT infrastructure, it can be very important to easily push firmware upgrades and security fixes across my entire IT infrastructure. So I can not only do that, but also prove that that device was updated and leverage that to do some dynamic reports for any sort of audits that may arise. So it's important to have this capability across your entire networking landscape. So what can that networking landscape look like? It really can be your full networking scope, from switches and routers to IP address management to load balancers and firewalls. This isn't a full list of every networking vendor that Ansible can connect to, but this is a common list of what I've seen from different companies. Really, it comes down to if there's an API that I can connect to, or there's a way to SSH into that device, I can provide network changes to it. So really start looking at how your networking landscape looks today to see if it's something that can be automated. So how does Ansible work in terms of networking? So it's different in your traditional virtual machines where typically Python or PowerShell is executed on that end device. For networking modules, they actually execute on the control node itself and then send the commands to those devices. What type of ways can I interact? So the four most common ways are the command module, which is sending a simple command like show interfaces, allows you to do those basic things that I might do on a device. Facts allow me to gather all the different facts, whether they're the interfaces, whether they're the host name. I can gather that in a structured manner, so I have structured data that I can use to generate those dynamic reports. Config module allows me to make configuration changes, again using traditional networking type code, but I can also use this for backups and things like that as well. And the more modern version is what we call a resource module. So as you can see in that example, I have a module just to manage ACLs for iOS XR. Same thing exists for Arista, same thing exists for the other different Cisco operating systems. This allows you to really manage individual interfaces by themselves. So what can that look like? So there's a simple example of using the modules to change VLANs. As you can see in this case, I'm using the Arista EOS VLANs module, and there's a different type of state from present or absent. There's this concept of merge, so just add in any VLANs that aren't currently present. I can do replaced, so it'll do that difference and remove ones that aren't part of this structured list that I have. I can do overridden, which maybe there are some other modules that have multiple interfaces or things like that that will completely erase, or deleted if I want to completely wipe out a particular interface. So this gives you a lot of flexibility as you're trying to manage your devices. I can start off with just merging, so adding in new configurations, and then as you get to that nirvana state of networking devices as code, I can start leveraging replaced or overridden to define exactly what my network configuration should look like. So what types of use cases are there? I can start small and grow from there, so I don't need to configure the entire networking device day one. I can start simply of taking a backup and restoring. So just pull that device configuration as it exists today, store it on a server, store it in GitHub, have a very quick and easy way to perform a backup and restore, leveraging something like a survey in the automation platform so I can recover if something goes wrong. As I talked about earlier with audits, having an ability to do dynamic documentation, so a read-only way to pull device information in structured data and put that into a nice format so users can keep track of what's going on. Scope config management means pick one resource, VLANs, ACLs, SNMP, and just manage that particular resource. A nice simple way to start to get at least one parameter of your networking devices in an expected state. As you start growing, then you start looking at compliance. So applying security posture hardening rules or additional firewall rules, I can start configuring those pieces and then looking beyond configuration management to operational state validation. This is a little more complicated and requires you to have what schema I want to validate it against, but allows you to have some operational capability to verify your networking devices. And then there's that nirvana state of automated NetOps. So I can have everything maintained in some sort of version control system like Git, and that can directly push out to my networking devices. And obviously I can build in development, QA, and production pipelines to manage that full lifecycle for me. So it's important to see how these pieces may play in your environment. But again, start small, start with the most challenging use cases, and then start building into that infrastructure as code idea with automated NetOps. So let's see some of these pieces and see really how I can manage a networking device. So to dive in the demonstration, I do first want to show the inventory that you'll need to set up. So this is part of the user guide specifically for Cisco iOS, but if you notice, I have to change several variables in order to properly connect to that device. Obviously, I'm not SSHing into a Linux server. I need to connect to that Cisco iOS device. So I'll need to change at the host level, group level, whether this is leveraging Ansible Navigator from the CLI or Automation Controller for the UI. I will need to make sure I set up Ansible Connection to connect via Network CLI, as well as the Ansible Network OS, in this case, to connect to Cisco iOS. Again, you should still use the fully qualified collection name, which is why it has those pieces in there. Another part that I do want to call out is you'll notice it uses Ansible user, Ansible password. That means I'm connecting via a machine credential. So make sure in Automation Controller, if I'm setting up credentials to connect to most networking devices, I want to use the machine credential, not the networking credential. Also, you can set the become method. So obviously I don't have sudo in a networking device. Typically they're enable. I can again set that in Automation Controller or in my inventory, as you can see here. So if I look at a basic playbook, in this case, leveraging the Cisco iOS collection, doing some very basic things like checking the version of the iOS device, I can just run the command show version. So this is exactly the same command as I type via the CLI on an iOS device. Same thing really applies if I want to do iOS configs, so I want to make configuration changes, or I can also use that iOS config module to do backups. So I can give it a specific file name, I can give it a specific path that I want that backup to go to, and as you can see here, I even remove some extra lines, so things that aren't related to the configuration or the passwords, I scrape all that out before I perform that actual backup. So I talked a lot about those resource modules. So I can leverage those resource modules to make all kinds of changes to my device, including the host name. I can use it to change the layer 3 interfaces. And if you notice, I can also use variables in this. So I don't have to exactly define what my device is. I can use variables to help calculate what those pieces are. So I don't have to have the inventory host name hard-coded for every single networking device. I can pull that directly from my Ansible inventory. And maybe I don't want to have to define what all the configurations are. I want to use variables. So I've also set up the capability to use a whole list of variables. If you notice here, I just import them at the beginning, and then everything else is just using those variables to change my configuration. And now I have that structured data in JSON format. So rather than, again, editing that individual YAML file, I could just make changes to this JSON and then leverage something like NetOps to automatically push this to my end device. And as you can see, I can still add in variables and things like that to here if I so desire. But in this case, I've got everything hard-coded, but I could certainly add in specific variables as well. So how does this work in actuality? What might this look like if I do a job run? So I actually ran that base variables job earlier. You can see that it just completed just a little bit ago. And I can actually look through those stored vars and I can see kind of what populates. So obviously, again, Ansible is idempotent. So if a change doesn't need to be made, it won't. So obviously when I pushed out to some of those devices, the host name was already set, so it didn't make that change. But there were some things that did get changed on that device. So maybe I updated the interfaces. I can click into this and I can see exactly what happened. The beauty of the resource modules, as I said before, I'm not running Python code on that end device. I'm just sending commands. So the resource modules show exactly what commands were sent to that device, as well as the before state and the after state. So this is great in terms of auditing, and especially if I'm not familiar with Ansible, I can see exactly what was done on that networking device by Ansible. So again, I can take that JSON from this, export that into something like a nice dynamic report, and create something like this. So this is the current state of all my networking devices. I can see the serial numbers if that's part of it. I can see the exact code version. So if I need to keep track of firmware, I can have that, as well as seeing some of the interfaces that have been set up on these devices. So this is all dynamically created. If something doesn't exist, in this case I haven't set up VLANs, it will just say no VLAN information available. So this gives me the exact state of my devices as they exist today. So it's great in terms of audits. I can just run a playbook that generates this report, show it to an auditor, show it to an internal security team, and then kind of go about the rest of my day. So it's a much, much easier way where instead of having to have the exact commands that I need to send to these devices, I can start looking at a JSON or the YAML file, which is much easier for someone to understand if they're not familiar with the specifics of Cisco versus Arista versus Juniper. So what can you do next? So there are several blogs and videos that have already been created that dive deeper into those use cases that I talked about earlier. So that 5 ways to get started with network automation is a blog, but also has a 30-minute video by Sean Cavanaugh and walks through the details of those different use cases. So you can see playbook examples, you can see all those pieces running, and have a much better idea of some good place to get started in terms of automation. I've also added in some additional blogs around multi-vendor management, looking at NetOps. So there's a new concept of event-driven Ansible and how I can start using NetOps to start, again, looking at some of those monitoring tools to maintain the health of my environment, and then looking at some of the validated content that's recently rolled out with a network.base collection. This allows you to very easily see what types of modules are available to you, what types of things exist across the multi-vendor environment that you may have. So appreciate you taking the time out to learn a little bit more about how Ansible can be used for networking environments. Again, there's just a cursory view to show some of the basics of connecting to a networking device and looking a little bit more about how resource modules can help. Please let me know if there are any additional questions. Thank you.